We are here today to discuss Resurrecting Legends. God. My thing is I get tongue-tied. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk about the documentary film Resurrecting Legends, Rebirth of the Mark IV. And who I have with me today is Curtis Boggs, the producer, writer, and director who has spent so much time working on this project. My name's Hannah Pewter. I also helped with some of the line editing and the producing. And so we're just going to jump right into it. So Curtis, tell us a little bit about the project. What was the inspiration? What inspired you to even start this project to begin with?
Well, actually, it was inspired by a friend of mine, Mark Miller, who's also a producer on the project. Mark's a race car driver, and he had a relationship with Riley Technologies. And of course, Bob Riley is the original chassis designer and engineer on the Mark IV project. Mm-hmm. And, the earlier cars, 66 GT cars as well. So when Mark told me about the project, he saw one of my other documentaries and just called me up and said, "Yeah, I think you need to do this." So Mark's the guilty party. It's his fault this got put together.
Well, and I think we're glad he did.
Absolutely glad he did. I grew up in a racing family. I raced myself. I raced Formula Fords and road racing and things. And I've always been fascinated by motorsports. And when this project came along, of course, everybody knows, the history of the Mark IV, won Le Mans, the 66, the Ford versus Ferrari movie. Of course, that takes us through the history up till 1966. Our documentary is dealing mostly with 1967, the following year. And the Mark IV was the next version of the car that they built. And, the car won by, I might have the figure a little bit wrong, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of like 33 miles over the second place car. I mean, absolutely just embarrassed them. So it's an exciting story.
It is, and the Mark IV is such an iconic piece of American history. As a storyteller, what is your hope that viewers will go away with after watching this film?
Well, there's so many elements. So, I had the pleasure of honoring, Bob Riley. Bob Riley, at the time of filming, was 93. And unfortunately, he passed away shortly after we were done filming. But the man's career, this is just one of multiple projects that he's done, and historical racing projects. Indy cars with A.J. Foyt, NASCAR with Dale Earnhardt. He's just got this list of hundreds of credits of racing engineering projects that he's worked on. So to be able to honor him was just it's a huge honor for me. Big responsibility, but that's probably, I'm going to carry that one with me forever. The other part of this is the history. A lot of people know a little bit about this and know that Ford kind of went over there to beat up on Ferrari and did quite a
Thank
job
God they
at
did.
It. Yes, did quite a job at it. So to be able to document that history, and tell that story, more people now know the story, and that's what I hope they get out of the documentary. The other interesting thing is part of this documentary, and the part that probably it makes me as emotional as most people when they watch this part, but here's Bob Riley. That project in 66 and 67 started his career. For the most part, that was like a big launch forward in his career. And here later in his life at 93 years old, Riley Technologies, they build race cars. They decided to get all the original parts, all the original drawings, and build continuation cars. Continuation meaning they are built exactly like they were built in 1967, down to every last rivet, nut, bolt, everything. They had to recast parts, make duplicates of the parts they had, before. And Bob got to see that car brought back to life and see that car on the racetrack before he passed away. In the documentary, there's a shot of him at the racetrack when he first sees it on the racetrack. The look on his face, the joy in his, and the smile it's hair raising.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To even shoot this film, you got tremendous access to stuff that no one normally can even see. Talk to us a little bit about what that was like, experiencing going there, just getting to see things that the average person maybe doesn't even know about, like some of the stuff that they pulled up for archives to even continue the process of building the Mark IV.
So, when they went and purchased, the company that built these cars for Ford was called CarCraft. And they did that, it was a private company, so Ford didn't have to deal with, the laws and the stuff based around union workers. So they had a private company, and those guys, a bunch of engineers and, racing geeks, they would work all night long on something because, they're obsessed with it. So that helped them get around some of the restrictions there. So Riley, they went back and they bought CarCraft. They bought all the assets, which included, some of the original castings, original tooling, original parts, all the body molds. But it also included a stack of the original drawings. And in the documentary, you'll see the drawings. Those drawings, they had Bob Riley's signature on them, and it's he
incredible.
Was able to go through those, and say, oh, this is a Mark II, this is a Mark III, this is, identify the different things, get all that together, and then he helped them get it into the computer, into modern day, computer aided design, CAD design, so they use some modern techniques as far as that's concerned, as far as drawing and and stuff like that. But they got all the original blueprints and stuff.
Yeah, it's incredible. Incredible. Yeah. With your background in car racing, how did that help when you were going to form the story? Because that, I'm sure, was a great asset, getting into the mindset of the car racing world.
So, yeah, I mean, being on that side of the fence, and I have an engineering background in racing engines as well. So when I walked into Riley, so I'm a racing fan, and Riley has this huge history of winning races, Le Mans, 24-hour Daytona multiple times. They're road racing legends. They built the Daytona prototypes. For me, it was like walking into the home of my heroes.
Oh yeah.
I walk into the shop and it's just like, ooh, I can't believe I'm here. I could pinch myself.
Yeah.
And I wasn't disappointed. Here's the thing: is in the process, I had to work with all of their, all of the crew, all the, the people there, that the fabricators, the people that lay up the fiberglass and composites and all of that stuff. And everybody there, first of all, are really wonderful people. But everybody that works there is like they're their own, their own entity in motorsports, in that they're, it's not just some guy. Everybody there has all these massive credits. Used to work in Formula One, used to do this, and just the amount of skill of everybody in that shop was, I was not really surprised, but I was very impressed.
So to make sure that you were authentic to the whole process of storytelling, did you have to work with any other historians or get any expert opinions as you went to craft the actual story?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, again, this is where Mark Miller comes in. Now, I've known Mark. I'm going to age both of us. I've probably known Mark somewhere around 30 years, I think. Yeah, something like that. It's been a while. So obviously Mark knows the history extremely well. And Mark has had, a 30-year history, that long relationship with Riley. So all the nuances of, in production side, dealing with them and what they like, what they don't like, scheduling,
Right.
all of those kind of production details. Mark was, very key in helping with that. And Bill Riley made himself very accessible. He's running multiple teams, so I tried not to, get him too involved. I didn't want to distract him from the job that he's doing, but he was fantastic. I could text him and get an answer right away, and so I had a lot of support there. The other support that I got was from the Henry Ford Museum. Henry Ford was fantastic. Most of the still photos we have, the historical photos, came from the Henry Ford.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, they were very generous. Then when we went to film with Roush, and of course Roush helped with story and background quite a bit. Bob Korn at Roush is Jack Roush's partner who helped start, Roush Racing and Roush Engineering. And his son Dennis, I had so much fun with Dennis. Dennis is a great guy. We had so much fun. But also, they just offered so much information, what happened in those days and how things were done. Especially on the engine side, they had to build a reproduction of the engine, the
Right.
original engine. And they built the engine to within 1 horsepower of the original engine. The horsepower curve, the torque, the personality of the engine is exactly like it was. So they did a fantastic job.
Is there any story, because not a lot of people get to interact with Bob Riley. Looking back, and especially now that he's passed, is there any interaction or story that you had with him that you'd like to share?
Yeah, Bob had to tell me all the things they got wrong in the Ford versus Ferrari movie, but all with good humor. First of all, he said that he absolutely loved the movie, and most of us in racing, most racing people absolutely love the movie. It is so well done, so well acted, so well shot. I love the movie. But that sparked a conversation between us, and I have some of this on film. It didn't make it into the documentary, but I have this in my hard drive. We talked about all of the history and all the things that went on, and what was in the film compared to what really happened. Who the nice people really were and the people that they made into not nice people. It got Hollywooded a little bit, but they made a good story out of it. So that's one thing. The other thing that is probably going to stay with me for a long time is just him as a person. Very, very warm, very kind, good sense of humor, very sarcastic humor. I adore sarcasm. So he was just a good person that loved to work on race cars, and he was obsessed. That's the thing. I think anybody that accomplishes anything above average, you have to be obsessed. And
Sure.
That's the thing. 93 years old, he still went to work every day.
Yeah.
He still worked on race cars. And then, on the weekends or evenings when the crew were going home, he'll have them put a car on the lift or something so he could work on it when, over the weekend or when they're at home or something like that. I mean, he loved what he was doing, and he was obsessed with it.
Yeah. It takes passion and beyond passion sometimes to get things done.
Absolutely, yes.
But on that note, a lot of storytellers and filmmakers, they write their scripts, they shoot everything's looking good, the export's done, they're good to go. But distribution is a stopping point for many filmmakers. So
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about the distribution process for this film, because it was not an easy one.
No, it wasn't. I got tasked with doing all the distribution, and I've owned a few businesses, besides the current production company, and I do like doing some of that kind of work. I certainly like being in control of some of that stuff, but it took several months to work through it. Had to find the distributors that you just didn't have a connection with, and find the ones that you did. But the whole industry is changing very quickly. So all of the advice I got from industry friends and my mentors from 5 years ago, it's all out the window. Doesn't care.
Rapidly changing.
Rapidly changing, yeah. I think it's going to land in a good place. So I think it's moving towards a lot more support for independent film, like we've done here. This is completely independent project. There's no studio money involved. There's no studio distributor involved. We did distribution ourselves. We're doing the marketing ourselves. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way around that. And to get your film on Prime, like we're on Prime, and I'm absolutely thrilled. I had 2 on my list, and Prime was one of the main ones. If I get these 2, I'm going to be happy. We're still working on the other one, but just to get it on there, your job's just beginning. So it's really the marketing and getting eyes on your film. That's the hard part, and that's where we are now. At the time we're taping this is just doing the marketing and stuff like that, and trying to boost it.
Yeah. So what would be like one reason you'd say, for the general audience, why would someone want to go see this film? What's the significance of this film?
Well, I think the significance is really, it's more than a film about a car. It's more than a film about one engineer. It's a film about American history. The 1967 Mark IV, is a historical race car. It went over, it was challenged, Le Mans, by, every race car in Europe, but primarily, we went over there to beat the Italians and did it. So it's a piece of American history.
Yeah. Anything else about the project that you think would be worth having a soundbite for? We covered the concept, we covered the Rileys, we covered going there, the historical elements, distribution.
Yes, something that I think is very significant about this, this documents Bill Riley's father and their relationship. So, their relationship. Bill is an amazing engineer, and runs a race team like I've never seen somebody run something. I mean, this guy, how he keeps all these balls in the air, how he juggles all of that he has to juggle, multiple race teams, multiple engineering projects. So he's very, for me, it was very inspirational to be around him. It's like, if somebody could do this, we can do anything we put our mind to, right? So it's very inspirational. But on top of that, it documents, in some form, it documents the relationship between him and his father. Mm-hmm. I wish we had time to get deeper into that. We certainly touched on it, but I think it's very significant for Bill that this documents his dad and his dad's history and his relationship with his dad.
Yeah, it's true. He'll have a piece of history to always look back on. Which, I mean, how many children get that opportunity, to watch a documentary about your dad and how much of a legend he was? It's pretty cool. It's cool from Bob Riley's perspective that he lived a life that is something future generations can look up to, and the reverse side of that is having the opportunity to watch it.
The interesting thing about Bob, and I can relate to this because this is where I think engineers and artists are similar. he was never happy with anything he did. Everything he worked on, including the Mark IV, as they're building this car and bringing it back to life, you know, he wants to go in and make changes to the suspension and, you know, the geometry and improve the car and all this stuff. And they had to hold him back. Like, we're building a continuation. It's supposed to be a historical duplicate or a continuation of the original car. It's like, no, you're not going to re-engineer the car, you know. And, you know, he came to terms with that. But, you know, I can relate because, you know, I finish a project, I finish a film, or I finish a shoot or something. I go home and I look at it. I might be happy for an hour. And then, you know.
And then you tear it to pieces.
Then I'm like, I could have done this different. I could have done that different. You know, and I do that a lot less than I used to. You know, I've come to really understand my style and, you know, the way I like things to look, the way I do things and stuff, and I've become very comfortable with that. So I'm not as unhappy as I used to be, but I look at stuff that I've done a year ago, and it's like, well, you know, if I had that, if I could do that again, I would do it completely different.
Yeah.
So.
But I think that's what makes, you know, us artists. Never being satisfied. Even after you finish something, you know, you keep striving for the next thing. You're like, oh, I did that? Oh, I forgot, because I'm already focused on the next target.
Oh,
right?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, artists are laser focused, you know, and I'm working with somebody now. I'm trying to get this job with a company that does medical stuff, and talking to this person, and, you know, part of the interview process is asking about, you know, how you interact with other creatives in the project, and you know, how you take on these projects and what happens and stuff. And the first thing I said to her was, you know, you've had a long career. You know what it's like to work with an artist. You throw an artist a bone, and they will not let go. They get laser focused. Oh, you gave me something to pay attention to, bang.
Yeah.
All right. And you know, I think that's a trait of a really good artist too. You know, because it, again, circling back to what I said earlier, you know, to do something exceptional takes exceptional work.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, but this leads. I got to ask you a couple questions now. It's your turn. You know, you're very exceptional in several different areas, and to me, as an artist, or in my personality, they seem to be complete opposites. So you're extremely well organized. You know, everybody that you've worked with, or that we've worked with, and you've produced projects for, everybody has just said, you know, where did you find her? You know, most amazing producer. You know, everything's just perfect, right?
That's the idea. As close as it can be.
As close as it can be. And, you know, of course, for me, that's a great relief. So, you know, if I'm, as an artist, I don't have to worry about that stuff, then I can concentrate on what I have to concentrate on. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's, you know, the best producer in the world that's what they do. And that's what you do. You know, and thank you, by the way. Thank you very much. But, you know, there's also the creative side. Mm-hmm. So during the course of this whole documentary, you know, you supported me through the whole thing, not just as a producer, but as a, you know, creative muse, or, you know, whatever you want to call it. But, you know, story edit, you know, we talked about a lot of things.
Yeah.
You supported it in a lot of different ways. Of course, you did the paper edit. And, you know, you basically were story editor, you know, or, you know, we did most of that together, but, you know, it was critical, you know, what you contributed. You know, I've said this to you, it wouldn't be what it is without you. And you know, it's interesting that you have those two pieces that you managed to fit together, but there's a very creative side and there's a very organized side. How do you make that work?
Yeah, it's funny because I used to be primarily on the very organized side, like very type A personality, but life happens. And as I've continued through life, and also, I do acting, and the more I've developed acting and being able to like let go, it's a weird balance of having complete control and at the same time being able to throw it all out for the sake of the story, right? And it's not a comfortable place to live, but as I've grown as a producer, yes, the technical, getting all those elements and logistics, that's what makes the show run. But then also being able to understand the creative side ultimately tells the better story. So doing both at the same time, that's like the sweet spot. It's taken a while to learn, but my personality has changed, completely changed from where I started. My literal personality has changed because you have to. Like in art and in space as an artist, you have to grow, you have to evolve, you have to stretch yourself into different elements. And I am a creative person, but bringing that into the producing side, that has been an intentional process. And I'm glad to see it's paying off.
Well, it's definitely paying off. At this point, there's several other documentary projects, on the books here that we're going to be working on and stuff. And, working with you on these projects, I'm really looking forward to it. The difference for me, of course, I'm not afraid to do these projects. I'm not concerned about getting them done, and I'm not concerned about the quality, in the sense that if I was doing it by myself, or if I had another producer that wasn't quite you, or had the same traits, I know the work wouldn't be the same. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking forward to doing more projects.
Same.
So how did you get started as a producer? Where did that come from?
So I started producing for live television when I was 18 years old. A large church, probably 3,000-4,000 member church, and I just volunteered. Just started volunteering, doing camera. They saw I had an eye for organization and directing. I did TD, directing in the back, and then moved to producing, and then, eventually graduated and decided, what do I want to do with my life? I kind of like this stuff. And, saw a lot of bad content. Right? And I was like, you know what? I want to strive to make something really good. In that era, that was kind of the Lord of the Rings were coming out, as the era of Pirates of the Caribbean, all this fantastic content. And it was just all very inspiring. Some of the older Star Wars, intentionally saying older Star Wars, not the new saga. But, there's just a lot of really good content coming out. Pixar, golden era. And, it's just inspiring. When art begets art, right? When you see something amazing and beautiful, it's inspiring to try to achieve that yourself. So I decided, from there, I went to film school, and from there, I've just, worked contracting and enjoy every project. Every project's completely unique, whether it's commercial, documentary, even, corporate stuff has its own flares that you can bring creativity and a well-done project for the client. That's even very satisfying. So there's so many different elements of it, from the relational element to your point, the creative element, the artistic element, and each project has its own flow. And finding that flow and working with the crew, whether it's crew you've worked with a million times or everyone's brand new. It's always a new box you unopen and you find the surprise inside. That's pretty much my story.
Well, good producing is just as creative as anything else. There's art in producing.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So where are you going from here? What are your bigger plans?
Well, I actually have a documentary I'm working on, which of course you're on board for. Yes, it's a documentary talking about October 7th, what happened after October 7th, and basically the U.S. foreign policy side of what happened, taking a look at why we weren't able to successfully negotiate to release hostages immediately after, why it took a different administration to get that done, the lack of coverage and mixed messaging within the media with everything that took place. So that's a current documentary I have in the works. Hopefully we'll be doing principal photography within the next couple months. That's the current project, and pretty excited about it.
Nice. So even looking farther past that, do you plan on kind of staying in the documentary world, or you're looking at TV, or?
Yeah, so I actually have 2 feature film scripts that are in the process of being written. One is a rom-com and one is an action. So those are kind of, Gary Marshall, there aren't Gary Marshall films anymore. There's a whole genre of rom-com chick flick that has basically dissolved since the early 2000s.
Right.
And my goal is to resurrect it.
Oh, fun
So
stuff.
yeah,
Yes,
I have a
yes.
very cute script that I'm working on in that direction. And then, of course, being in this area, being around the military, I have an action film that will be a political action thriller that I'm also working on. So the end goal, and where I'm already starting to head, is a feature film.
Nice.
Narrative feature film, yeah.
So are you writing these scripts?
Yes, I am.
Oh, here comes
Yes.
the creative.
Yes,
Oh, that's
I love
awesome.
to write. And the funny thing is, I know people talk about writer block, and I do get writer block, but when I go to write, I just see the story, and I don't normally have too much of an issue getting it out. The challenge, ironically, is actually just getting the time. Because,
Life.
as a freelancer, you're usually booking gigs to stay busy booking gigs. So
Yes, I
Yeah.
know about that one. Yes.
yeah, but yeah, no, I'm pretty excited. Being able to tell your own story, especially narratively. Having gone to film school, the narrative pull never leaves. You always have that passion to just create your own story from nothing, which of course is narrative filmmaking, and it's so powerful. Like, done well, it's so powerful.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a huge challenge. I have to admit that everybody loves narrative. I love from a photography standpoint. I love principal photography on narrative.
Yes.
You usually have a little bit bigger crew. You have an opportunity to really craft a visual story.
Exactly.
Versus documentary. I tend to try and craft a visual story in documentary more so than I don't really do just a lot of cinema verite or just unlit, and
Yeah.
I tend to pay a little more attention to the image. But in narrative, there's a chance to really, from start to finish, to work with a director and a writer, and go through and shot list and actually create and craft a visual story. And that's very appealing to me.
Yes.
And that's, as you know, that's a lot of work. That's a ton of work.
It is. Well, the whole concept of taking basically an idea, inventing characters, inventing a storyline, inventing a through message, right? It's an extensive creative process, but I think that's what makes it the most rewarding in a way. Not that documentaries aren't, but the ability to just create absolutely from nothing, just paint a whole world. Yes,
Yes,
exactly.
yes.
That your audience is immersed into something that they didn't even know existed, and then they live in it for that time frame that you have them. It's challenging, but it's exciting.
Yeah, that's you're right. That's the whole difference between documentary and narrative. Documentary, in that regard, for the most part, there's a story there, and you're just telling that story. So you have to investigate and pull the story out and stuff. But it is very different than crafting a whole world.
Yes.
And some of it's pretty amazing. Some of the shows, that I'm addicted to Netflix, and there's some great shows on TV. And to be able to craft those stories, it's interesting. I don't think I have that skill. At least I've written some narrative, but I tend to really like telling people's stories. I like to learn about people. I like to learn about the crafts and how they got to where they are and their backgrounds, and tell those stories. I love telling people's stories. But that transfers over to narrative too.
Yeah. It does.
Hand me a script. I want to figure out how to tell that story too.
Yeah.
No,
But to your point on that, like the thing about the narrative process is there's the story you write, there's the story your cinematographer sees, there's the character your actors see, which you don't know how that's going to come out when they actually act out that scene. There's so many layers of revealing and unveiling the actual core of what you're telling. In some ways, it's not too different from documentary storytelling. You may have your script, but it's going to change continually. And then there's the edit, and then there's so many things that evolve, and it is a little more structured in a way, but in another way, there are so many other players with a creative spin on what's going on. That can make it better. That can make it better.
That's the creative process. You know, it's none of this stuff, as you said, it doesn't get written in stone because you have a script with words on it. You know, when it ends up in the final edit and stuff, it's rarely exactly what's on the paper. And the ability to, you know, be comfortable with that and let that happen is a very important part of the creative process.
Yes.
And I've worked with some people that have a big problem with that. You know, it's got to be, you know, exact this and don't tell me your ideas or, you know, whatever. You know, they're trying to do this exact thing, and it's like, you know, you have to in a crew, you have to surround yourself, you know, with people that you're comfortable with in those situations. Because it takes a village to make a great
Absolutely.
thing. You know, and you know, I'm going to circle this back to the relationship that you and I have in this documentary. Again, like I'm not joking when I say that it would not be what it is today without your involvement and the interaction that you and I had. You know, the discussions about, you know, even, you know, I like to complain, so that, you know, the days I'm complaining about, I got this interview and I don't like what he said, you know, whatever it was.
Yeah.
Right? You know, those discussions, but all of those discussions, you know, eventually they form, you know, the end product. They have an influence on it.
Right.
And that stuff's critical. You know, I've been on sets with, you know, directors and DPs, especially some DPs that were, you know, you stay in your corner, you don't talk, you don't, you know, do what you're told, and, you know, and you know, just very regimented. And I always felt like, you know, that kind of stuff just, you know, held the creative part back. It didn't help the process.
Right.
You know, the crew that we work with, you know, our G&E crew and everybody that we work with have a tremendous amount of experience, and, you know, and in many cases more experience than I do. You know, when I'm trying to light something or I'm trying to get a particular look, you know, the crew a lot of times has more experience to get what I'm trying to get to, and to, you know, to shut them off, it doesn't make sense to me. You know, everybody has input, and that's the way crews should work, right?
Absolutely. Everyone knows their craft, and ideally you surround yourself with a team where everyone is their own artist in their department, and they're all trying to achieve something great. And when you have that shared commonality, that's when you make movie magic.
That's when great things happen.
That's when great things happen.
Absolutely.